Boston, Fall 2003. I stood beside my husband's open casket, my fingers gripping the edge so tightly that the polished wood felt like ice under my nails. My eyes wandered over the crowd of black coats and solemn faces until they froze on a man sitting in the back row. My breath caught in my throat because that man was Robert, alive, and staring right back at me as if daring me to react. The room seemed to tilt, the soft hum of the overhead lights growing louder, drowning out the hushed murmur of voices and the faint strains of the organ music. My heart slammed against my ribs, a sharp, cold fury starting to bubble beneath the initial shock. For a split second, I wondered if grief was playing tricks on me, if my mind had finally buckled under the weight of the last 2 weeks. But then he shifted ever so slightly in his chair, tilting his head the way he always did when he wanted me to keep my mouth shut. The funeral home smelled of lilies and coffee, with that faint undertone of floor polish that never quite covers the scent of old carpets. Relatives I hadn't seen in years sat in clusters, some genuinely teary-eyed, others sneaking glances at the buffet table in the hallway. Carol, my neighbor and self-appointed keeper of the neighborhood's gossip, had already been up to the casket 3 times, making sure everyone saw her dab her eyes with the tissue she'd been waving like a flag all morning. She was leaning over to whisper something into Ethan's ear, Robert's nephew, who sat in the front row with his notepad, jotting down names like this was some kind of business networking event instead of a funeral. Uncle Jim, already reeking of bourbon, shuffled to the podium to say a few words. He launched into a rambling speech about how we should all cherish every moment and call each other more often, then ruined the sentiment by pointing out that funerals are the only time we all get together anymore. As he stepped down, he plucked a glazed donut from the refreshment table and took a loud bite, powdered sugar dusting his suit jacket. In the far corner, 2 teenage cousins slouched in their chairs, scrolling through their phones and only looking up when their mothers elbowed them. I forced my eyes back to the casket. Robert looked peaceful there, too peaceful, his hands folded neatly, wearing the navy suit I'd insisted on for our son's wedding years ago. I remembered the morning 2 weeks ago when it had all happened. He'd been sitting in the recliner, watching the morning news with a cup of coffee. One moment he was grumbling about the Red Sox. The next he clutched his chest and slumped forward. The EMT said it was a massive heart attack. Quick and painless, they told me. I'd taken comfort in that, foolishly thinking at least he hadn't suffered. But now, seeing him alive in the back row, my mind was racing. Was it a twin I didn't know about? No, Robert was an only child. A cruel joke? Impossible. His expression was too deliberate, too controlled. My stomach twisted as anger started to outweigh the shock. I searched the room to see if anyone else had noticed him, but everyone's attention was fixed on the service. Robert didn't move, didn't blink, just kept looking at me with that faint, infuriating smirk that told me this was no accident. Ethan turned in his seat at one point to glance toward the back, but his eyes skimmed right past Robert without recognition. Or maybe he was pretending. That thought only fueled the gnawing suspicion already building in my gut. Carol caught me looking distracted and shot me a sympathetic smile, clearly mistaking my expression for grief. If only she knew. The minister's voice droned on about Robert's devotion to family and generous spirit, phrases that now felt like bad punchlines to a joke only I understood. I kept stealing glances toward the back row, half expecting him to vanish like a mirage, but he stayed put, steady and solid, until one of the ushers moved toward that side of the room. In the brief moment my view was blocked, he was gone. Just an empty chair where he'd been, and a strange heaviness in my chest. I considered leaving right then, rushing outside to see where he'd gone. But a stronger part of me needed to stay. If I walked out now, maybe I'd convince myself later that it was all in my head, some cruel trick of the light and grief. No, better to see the service through, to hold my ground until I knew exactly what I'd seen. The rest of the ceremony blurred together. Carol cornered a cousin to share some exclusive detail about Robert's last days. Uncle Jim polished off his donut and went back for a second. The teenagers were now quietly laughing over something on a screen. And I stood there, my mind miles away, already planning what I'd do when I found him again. Because I would find him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. When the service ended and the guests began trickling toward the parking lot, I fell into the slow procession, keeping my eyes down and my pace steady. Carol tried to catch me for a chat, but I mumbled something about needing a moment alone and slipped away. I saw him, Robert or whoever he was, moving quickly toward the street, hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn leather jacket. He didn't look back once. I followed at a distance, making sure to blend with the other mourners until he turned a corner and headed toward the main road. I reached the bus stop just in time to see him cross the street. Of course, the bus I needed was late, 10 minutes on the schedule turned into 20. When it finally arrived, it was nearly full, the heater blasting hot air and the driver's radio tuned to a country station at full volume. Some twangy voice sang about losing a truck, a dog and a girl over and over, and every beat grated on my nerves. The smell of wet coats, cheap coffee and diesel filled the air, and I had to grip the cold metal pole to keep from losing him in the sea of faces outside. Through the foggy window, I spotted him walking at a steady clip, weaving through pedestrians. The bus lurched forward, then stopped again for a red light, giving me just enough time to keep track of his dark jacket and the way he tilted his head slightly when he passed people, as if to avoid recognition. My heart was thudding hard enough to make me dizzy, but I couldn't look away. He finally stopped in front of a narrow brick apartment building, the kind you find in the older parts of Boston where the paint flakes off the window frames and the fire escapes look like they haven't been inspected in decades. Without hesitation, he disappeared inside, the heavy door swinging shut behind him. I stayed on the bus until the next stop, then doubled back, lingering on the opposite sidewalk. From where I stood, I could see that most of the mailboxes in the lobby had peeling labels with scribbled names, some just marked 2A or 3B. The building smelled faintly of fried onions and cigarette smoke even from outside. I considered going straight in, knocking on every door until I found him, but the thought of confronting him without a plan made my stomach twist. If I was wrong, if this was some strange coincidence, I'd look like a lunatic. And if I was right, I needed to be smart about it. I decided to start with Carol. If there was gossip to be found about this address, she'd know it. That evening, I called her under the pretense of thanking her for coming to the service. As expected, she didn't waste time before slipping into neighborhood chatter. When I casually mentioned the street name, she perked up immediately. Oh, that place? There's a young woman there, maybe early 30s, lives with a little boy. No man around though, well, not officially. People say some guy visits her late at night, never stays for breakfast. Carol chuckled at her own phrasing, but my pulse quickened. Her words sat heavy in my mind long after I hung up. A woman with a child. A man who comes and goes. It didn't take much for my thoughts to leap to the worst conclusion. Robert had another life and I just stumbled into it. The idea felt absurd and yet horribly plausible, especially after seeing the way he'd looked at me, steady, calculating, like someone who knew exactly how much damage his presence could cause. I spent the next 2 days circling back to that building at different times. Once in the early morning when commuters rushed toward the T station. Once in the late afternoon when the shadows stretched long across the street. Each time I scanned the door waiting for him to appear. I caught sight of the woman once, dark hair pulled into a loose bun, carrying a grocery bag in one arm and guiding a boy who looked no older than 10 with the other. She didn't glance my way, but the boy's face stuck with me. Something about the set of his jaw, the way he narrowed his eyes against the wind, stirred a faint, uneasy recognition. By the third evening I'd made up my mind. I wouldn't go to the police, not yet. They'd need proof, and all I had was a series of glimpses and a gut feeling. No, I needed to catch him myself, to stand in front of him and hear whatever excuse or lie he'd crafted. Then maybe I'd decide what to do next. I found a spot near the corner where I could see the entrance clearly without being obvious, the street lamp above flickering every few seconds. My hands were cold in my pockets, but my resolve was steady. Robert wouldn't hide forever. And when he stepped out of that door, I'd be waiting. I didn't have to wait long. Late on a Thursday afternoon, I saw the building's front door swing open and that same dark-haired woman step out with the boy, both bundled in jackets. They headed down the block, turning the corner toward the grocery store I'd spotted earlier in the week. My pulse picked up. This was my chance. I crossed the street, pushed open the heavy front door, and climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my knees protesting but my determination unshaken. The hallway smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and old dust. Most of the apartment doors had paint chipping around the edges, numbers nailed on crooked. I stopped at the one I'd seen them use, 3B, and knocked firmly. Footsteps shuffled inside. A lock turned, and the door opened just enough for me to see a woman's face. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 32, with tired eyes and a wary expression. This had to be Amanda. She kept one hand on the door as if ready to slam it shut. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice flat but tinged with tension. "I'm looking for Robert," I said evenly, watching her reaction. For a fraction of a second, her eyes flicked toward the interior of the apartment before snapping back to me. "There's no Robert here," she replied too quickly, her lips pressing into a thin line. I shifted slightly to peer past her. The hallway behind her was narrow, opening into a small living room. On the coat rack hung a familiar dark jacket, the same one I'd seen him wearing at the funeral. Beside it were men's boots, worn at the toes, and a baseball cap I knew by heart. Then I spotted it, a framed photo sitting on a side table. Amanda stood next to Robert, both smiling stiffly at the camera, with a boy in front of them holding what looked like a birthday cake. Before I could speak again, a man's voice came from inside. "Amanda? Who's at the door?" My heart slammed against my ribs. Robert stepped into view, and for a moment, time stopped. He looked healthy, maybe even fitter than when I last saw him alive. His skin had more color, his posture more assured. For a heartbeat, there was genuine shock in his eyes, but it vanished quickly, replaced by something harder, colder. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, moving closer until he was standing right behind Amanda. She shifted to the side, and he took the door from her, blocking my view of the rest of the apartment. "You shouldn't be here, Linda," he said, his voice low but steady. "I saw you," I said. "At the funeral." His expression didn't change. "You need to let this go. It's not your concern anymore." The words hit like ice water. I felt my breath quicken, anger pushing its way to the surface. And then the boy appeared from behind the couch, clutching a comic book. He was small for his age, maybe 10, with dark hair and sharp features that were achingly familiar. Robert placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is my son," he said, and there was something in his tone, defiant, almost daring me to challenge it. The room seemed to narrow, the air heavier. I couldn't trust myself to speak without shouting. Amanda's eyes were on the floor, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. The boy glanced between us, sensing the tension but not understanding its weight. I took a step back. "I'll be in touch," I said finally, forcing my voice to stay even. Robert didn't respond, just closed the door with a slow, deliberate motion. The lock clicked, and I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the peeling paint, hearing faint muffled voices from inside. The walk back to the street felt longer than it was. I thought about heading straight to the police, but the reality set in before I reached the corner. What did I have? No photos, no recordings, nothing but my word against theirs. For all I knew, they could deny everything and shut me out completely. By the time I got home, the anger had cooled into something more dangerous: resolve. If I couldn't drag him into the light now, I'd find a way to do it later. I wasn't done with Robert. Not even close. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's hand on that boy's shoulder and the way Amanda wouldn't look me in the eye. By morning, the restless energy had sharpened into a plan. If Robert thought he could vanish into another life without me finding out how, he'd underestimated me. There was one person who might know the details: Ethan. He'd been too eager at the funeral, too quick to take charge, and now I couldn't shake the feeling he'd been managing more than just flower arrangements. I called him mid-morning, using a tone that was light but firm. I told him I needed to go over some paperwork from the estate and that it couldn't wait. He invited me over without hesitation, and within an hour I was at his small condo on the edge of Dorchester, the kind of place where the carpet was still the same beige from the late 90s and the blinds rattled when the heat kicked on. Ethan opened the door in jeans and a faded Patriots hoodie, holding a coffee mug. He smiled when he saw me, but the smile faltered as soon as I stepped inside and said, "I saw Robert." The words hung in the air, and I could watch the color drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again before he managed a shaky, "Where?" I didn't give him details right away. Instead, I watched him squirm, his eyes darting toward the kitchen like maybe he could run in there and buy himself time. Finally, he exhaled, sat down heavily on the couch, and rubbed his face with both hands. "Okay. I guess you might as well know," he muttered. "It's not what you think." He had no choice. What followed was a tangled mess of excuses and half-truths, but the thread was clear enough. Robert had racked up serious debts: credit cards maxed out, loans he couldn't repay, and money owed to people Ethan described only as the kind you don't want knocking on your door. The pressure had built until Robert decided the only way out was to disappear. Ethan claimed he'd helped arrange everything: a fake death, falsified paperwork, and the quiet burial of an empty casket. The banks closed the accounts, the collection agency stopped calling, and Robert could live free again, if you considered hiding in a rundown apartment freedom. As Ethan talked, his voice took on a pleading tone. "This wasn't about hurting you," he insisted. "It was about survival. You would have been dragged into it. This way you're safe." Safe. The word made me want to laugh and spit in his face at the same time. My life had been torn apart, my dignity shredded, and he thought safety was the consolation prize. I was about to leave when something slipped from his mouth that made me stop cold. He referred to Amanda, by her first name, casually, like someone who'd known her well. When I asked how, he hesitated, then admitted she'd been his girlfriend a few years back. My stomach tightened. The connection was too close for comfort. It got worse. When I pressed about the boy, Ethan shifted uncomfortably and wouldn't meet my gaze. "Look, I don't know for sure," he said, "but there's a chance he's mine." The words landed like a punch. So Robert's son might not even be his. This whole thing was starting to look less like a desperate escape from danger and more like a sordid little web of selfish decisions, lies and betrayals, one that both men were tangled in up to their necks. I left Ethan's condo with the winter wind whipping my face, but inside I felt strangely calm. The outrage was still there, but it had settled into something sharper, something useful. I could blow this whole thing open, go to the police, drag Robert and Ethan into courtrooms and news headlines. Or I could use it. The thought grew as I walked to my car. Robert was living under the radar, terrified of being exposed. Ethan had a history with Amanda and a secret paternity question hanging over him. If I played it right, they'd both give me exactly what I wanted just to keep me quiet. By the time I turned the key in the ignition, I knew this wasn't going to end with me storming into a police station. This was going to end with me in control. And to do that, I needed one final move, one that would box Robert into a corner he couldn't slip out of. I thought about Ethan's guilty eyes, Robert's smug smirk, and Amanda's silence, and I knew exactly how to start setting the trap. It was time to prepare my checkmate. A month passed before I made my move. I let the weeks roll by quietly, giving Robert and Ethan the illusion that I had swallowed their story and moved on. In truth, I was spending my days in lawyers' offices, courthouses, and with a private investigator who knew how to dig without leaving footprints. Piece by piece, I assembled the documents I needed: property transfers, legal loopholes, and enough proof of Robert's fake death to make any prosecutor salivate. By the time I was done, I held the kind of leverage that could strip him of everything in a single afternoon. When I finally called Robert, I kept my voice neutral, almost warm. I told him we needed to meet somewhere private to clear the air. I chose a small roadside cafe in a sleepy suburb, the kind of place with vinyl booths, chipped coffee mugs, and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. It was quiet enough for a conversation that could change everything. He arrived 10 minutes late, wearing the same leather jacket I'd seen him in the day he walked into that apartment. He slid into the booth across from me, his expression guarded but tinged with curiosity. "What's this about, Linda?" he asked, trying to sound casual. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed a thick folder on the table between us. "Open it," I said. He hesitated, then flipped it open. Inside were copies of property deeds, bank account statements, and legal filings. His name was on some, but mine was on all the updated versions. "That," I said evenly, "is everything you own. Or rather, everything you used to own. Including the apartment you've been hiding in." His brow furrowed, and for the first time in years I saw real fear flicker in his eyes. Before he could speak, I laid a second, smaller envelope on top of the folder. "These," I continued, "are the police reports and legal documents detailing your so-called death. Fake death, Robert. Fraud. Enough to put you behind bars." He sat back, exhaling slowly. "So what now? You going to turn me in?" "I already have," I said. "But here's the thing, you have one way out. You sign over every remaining asset in your name to me. Today. If you do that, I'll speak to the right people and make sure you get the lightest possible sentence. Maybe even walk out with probation. Refuse and you'll lose the apartment, your so-called new life, and your freedom." He stared at me for a long time, jaw tight. I could almost hear the war in his head, pride versus survival. In the end, survival won. He nodded once, curtly, like a man accepting terms in a game he no longer had the pieces to play. We left the cafe together and drove straight to a notary's office. The signatures were done in silence, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the room. He didn't look at me when we were finished. I gathered the papers, thanked the notary, and walked out into the gray afternoon without waiting for him. By the end of the week, the paperwork was finalized. Robert had nothing left that he could hold over me, and Ethan stopped calling after his last attempt to smooth things over went unanswered. I didn't need them in my life anymore, not their lies, not their excuses. On a rainy Saturday morning, I sat in my kitchen, the steady patter of water against the windows filling the quiet. The air smelled of fresh coffee, and the warmth of the mug in my hands felt like the first real comfort I'd had in months. Outside, the street was empty except for a lone car moving slowly through the drizzle. I thought about the look on Robert's face in that cafe, the moment he realized the game was over. And then I thought about how easy it had been to let him believe, up until that moment, that he still had the upper hand. Sometimes, to win, you have to let your opponent think they've already beaten you. It lulls them into complacency, makes them sloppy. Then you strike, and by the time they realize what's happened, it's too late. Life favors those who know when to endure and when to act. I'd endured enough. And now, finally, I'd acted. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.